this fight. And with his righteousness across your chest, salvation for your head, the belt of truth around you now, with the shield of faith in hand, and with his peace upon your feet, everywhere you go. His word will be the sword you keep, your covered head to toe. Your covered head to toe. And with his peace upon your feet, everywhere you go. His word will be the sword you keep, your covered head to toe. We've buried dreams, laid them deep into the earth behind us, said our goodbyes at the grave, but everything reminds us. God knows we ache when he asks us to go on. How do we go on? We will sing to our souls, we won't bury our hope. Where he leads us to go, there's a Red Sea road. When we can't see the way, he will part the waves, and we'll never walk alone down a Red Sea road. How can we trust when you say you will deliver us from all of this pain that threatens to take over us? Well, this desert's dry, but the ocean may consume, and we're scared to follow you. So we'll sing to our souls, we won't bury our hope. Where he leads us to go, there's a Red Sea road. When we can't see the way, he will part the waves, and we'll never walk alone down a Red Sea road. Oh, help us believe you are faithful, you're faithful when our hearts are breaking. You are faithful, you're faithful. We'll grant us eyes to see. You are faithful, you're faithful. Teach us to sing. You are faithful, you're faithful, you're faithful. And we'll sing to our souls, we won't bury our hope. Where he leads us to go, there's a Red Sea road. When we can't see the way, he will part the waves, and we'll never walk alone down a Red Sea road. No, we'll never walk alone down a Red Sea road. No, we'll never walk alone down a
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. Welcome to the workshop. Shepherding with your voice, underline the word your voice. This is a workshop on sermonic borrowing, plagiarism, stealing, using other people's material. I'm going to use all those different phrases kind of interchangeably. But before we kind of get into things, probably ought to do a little bit of introduction. If you've been kind of following through this preaching track at all, you might have looked through the names and thought to yourself, okay, Mark Christian, recognize that guy. Drew Sherman, recognize that guy. Mark Scott, recognize that guy. But who's this Jason guy? And how do you say his last name? Is it Nick, Nitch? Let me give you a couple little helpers here. My last name is Poznich, Jason Poznich. If you need a little mnemonic device, you just pretend like you're taking pictures of a guy named Nick and you say Poznich, and that usually will work. I am in my second year teaching here at Ozark. I took over for Mark in his quasi-retirement from the school. So I teach most of our preaching classes. Prior to teaching here, I taught for 6 years at a sister school of ours called Central Christian College of the Bible up in Moberly, Missouri, about 4 or 5 hours north from here. So technically, I'm in my 8th year of teaching preaching courses and kind of leading preaching programs at our undergraduate institutions. So that's a little bit kind of about my backstory. And kind of the impetus behind this particular workshop is, in some ways, Phillips Brooks' classic definition of preaching. If you think back to your Homiletics 101 day, you may remember his little definition that preaching is truth through the personality of the preacher. And if we believe that to be true, then at what point do we abdicate our responsibility as preachers when we bring in the voice of someone else's style, someone else's personality? When does it become not our voice preaching and stewarding the God-given responsibility and calling that he's given us? And when does it become something else? In other words, how far is too far? Is there an ethical line that we can cross towards unethical use of other people's material when we preach? Is it possible that we can commit sermonic sin when it comes to using other people's material? Can we commit homiletical heresy? Is it possible that we can commit moral failure when it comes to how we use other people's material? Moral failure is not just sexual sin, abhorrent pride. I think we can commit moral failure when it comes to how we use the material of others. So the question then becomes, where's the line? Now, I want to go ahead and throw out a disclaimer. My goal this afternoon in our workshops is to disappoint you. I'm actually not going to answer that question, where is the line? I do hope to give you some tools and some things to chew on, some different arguments on different sides, and you should have received a handout that we'll go through a little bit later that's really going to complicate matters, which is part of my agenda today, is to make the waters a little bit more muddy and a little bit more complex for you to recognize that, at least in my understanding, in my impression, this isn't a black or white issue. It's not a yes or no issue. It's not a do it or don't do it kind of issue. There's some complexity and some nuance to the issue. And I don't know if sermon plagiarism, sermon borrowing, sermon stealing is on the rise, but it sure kind of seems like it is. It may just be the digital age that we live in, that those kind of stories we hear, sometimes it's high-profile stories. I took a screenshot as I was doing research for this. I think we've got it. Maybe we can put it up on the screen here. Yeah? No? Maybe not. Well, I had a screenshot. I had a screenshot of a pretty high-profile, well-known case that if you were to Google like a name, I'm not going to give the name, but if you were to Google it, you could kind of figure that out. Sometimes high-profile cases get noticed, and this particular case that I'm referencing made it all the way to the New York Times. National publication. But even if you're not a high-profile preacher, and no offense to any of you in here, my guess is most of you are probably not high-profile in terms of everybody around the country knows your name. That's my guess. A few of you probably are, but not all of you. But even if you have a lesser-known name, in a lesser known church, that doesn't mean it won't make it to the local news. As I was doing research for this, I just kind of would plug and play different phrases. Pastor resigns for stealing sermon, or preacher plagiarizes message, and looking for different stories and seeing what would surface. And there were several that were higher profile, but there were also just kind of some local news type stories. One in North Carolina somewhere, for instance, of a local preacher in that town who resigned because he was caught repeatedly using other people's material without giving credit. So this is something that seems to be surfacing. Whether it's happening more, I don't know, but we're at least becoming more aware of it in recent years. And it kind of seems like it goes through waves. Like every 10 years or so, some new scandals kind of emerge in the area of going too far when it comes to using other people's material. So let me start by just kind of giving you my backstory when it comes to how I've been exposed to preachers using other people's material in maybe healthy or maybe unhealthy ways. I'll give you two quick stories. Story number one, when I was in located church ministry, I made a rookie mistake. My rookie mistake was I was going to be on vacation, or I was at a conference, something. I forget exactly why I was traveling. But I had my preaching calendar, I had my personal calendar, and I didn't think to sync the two of them up. And so I had planned a 5-part sermon series through the book of Job. And I had an elder who was a very gifted communicator who would normally fill in for me whenever I was gone. And so I asked this particular elder, hey, would you be willing to fill in for me while I'm going to be gone this particular Sunday? And he was like, absolutely, I'd be happy to fill in. Are we in a series, standalone? What do you want me to do? And I was like, well, we're going to be in a series on Job. I haven't looked at the calendar yet. Let me get back and see the calendar and figure out exactly which week I need to fill in. The week that I had assigned to him was the dialogue between Job and his 3 friends. All of it. Job chapter 3 through chapter 31. A non-Bible college trained elder who preached about twice a year, I said, here, tackle 29 chapters, good luck. And after I realized what I had done, I face-palmed, and then I gave him a couple resources. John Piper had done some stuff on Job. He had actually preached a sermon on Job 3 through 31. I had an audio file. I had a manuscript of it, so I forwarded those on to my elder, and I said, hey, these might be helpful resources as you're thinking about your particular sermon. So I head out of town, I come back, open up our podcast, and I press play and listen to the sermon to find out, at the beginning of the message, he says, hey, Jason gave me this assignment to preach Job 3 through 31, pointed me to these resources, and I was reading John Piper's message and thought, you know what? I don't think I could do it better myself. So I'm just going to read to you Piper's message. And so for the next 37 minutes, he read John Piper's message word for word from the manuscript. And I thought to myself, well, that's not what I was intending, but at least you gave him credit. That's story number one. Story number two, when I started in the Bible college world as a professor, so back when I taught at Central, it was probably my second, maybe my third year as a professor, and every spring our faculty would select 8 to maybe 10 different students to give a senior sermon in front of the chapel audience. One of those senior students was a former TA of mine. And so he got up and he began preaching a sermon on the story of Zacchaeus. And within 30 seconds, I recognized this sermon from Zacchaeus, because it was a sermon that I assigned as a listening assignment in one of my preaching classes from a now deceased African-American preacher named E.K. Bailey. Sermon's called The Testimony of a Tax Collector. It's a really creative, really brilliant take on what might have prompted Zacchaeus to get up in that tree. And so he began preaching and basically just ripped the entire sermon off, never mentioning what he was doing. Sermon gets over, and the faculty convenes a week or two later, after all the sermons have been preached, and from those 8 or 10 sermons that were preached, we then chose the class orator. He won by 1 vote. Now, when you hear those two stories, I don't know what tension surfaces within you, but I feel differently hearing those two stories. When I think about the story of my elder, We're talking about a guy who is not Bible college trained, who works 40 plus hours a week outside the church, who's teaching a Sunday school class, leading a small group, raising 3 teenage kids at the time, and he's giving credit for the message that he's preaching. My student, on the other hand, was deceptively misleading his audience to convince us that this creative message was his own when in fact it was not, in hopes that he would receive an honor or an accolade that ultimately he did receive. So here's what I want to state right now. When it comes to using other people's material in our sermons, it's not level playing field. There are different layers to this, different ways to do it, some that are healthier, some that are more unhealthy. You should have a handout with you. What I want to do for the next, 10 minutes or so maybe, is kind of walk you through that handout. At the top, you have what I'm calling 4 layers of sermonic borrowing or sermonic use. And on the left-hand column there on the side, you'll see 9 different types of sermonic use. Let me start by walking you through the top there, top 4. So first one you'll see is deceptive stealing. What do we mean by deceptive stealing? Deceptive stealing is taking somebody else's sermonic material without their permission and then using that in your context without citation. Whole sermon, part of a sermon, I don't have permission to use it, I'm taking it, I'm using it, and I'm not telling you that it didn't come from me. It's deceptive to your listeners, and it's stealing because you didn't get permission, okay? So that's kind of the first one there. Next one right beside that is sided stealing. What is sided stealing? Sided stealing is you're still taking material that you don't have permission to take, but when you present it to your listeners, you're acknowledging where you got it. You're offering citation. Then the next one over is deceptive borrowing. You have permission here. Maybe it's from like a church that kind of open sources all of their material. They give blanket permission, or maybe it's somebody that you contact, you get the material. You have permission, but when you present that information, you play it off like it's yours. You don't acknowledge where it came from. So you're deceiving your listeners even though you have permission to utilize it. The fourth one there across the top is sided borrowing. You've got permission, and you acknowledge where it came from with your audience. So those are kind of the four layers. Now that begins to muddy the waters a little bit when we start thinking about all the different ways that we can utilize other people's material. But as we go down the left-hand side, we realize that it gets even muddier. The list that you have there on the left-hand side, the types of use, is not a comprehensive list. I was just giving you kind of a template, some things to think through, but there are 9 items on that list, starting at greater quantity of use down to lesser quantity of use. So like the entire sermon manuscript, word for word at the top, sermon outline, entire outline, then maybe just like the main headings, kind of the main points that you would use, or maybe an entire movement, like your whole introduction, you might have pulled from another source, and you might have used that, or maybe like one of your points and everything that went with it, maybe that came from another place, or maybe just illustrations, stories, jokes, prop ideas, or maybe well-crafted sentences, stuff that was on a screen that you thought, oh, that's really well stated, I want to make sure that I grab a hold of that. Or maybe biblical insights that you got from a preacher, or even some of the resources that you're studying with. Sermon titles, sermon media, like a video illustration that was made by a church, sermon graphics, bumper videos. Now here's where it gets muddy and messy. When you take the 4 layers that I've outlined earlier and the 9 types that you've seen there, you see on your document 36 different placeholders. Ultimately, there are 36 different ways, and then some, because not everything is accounted for on this document, but 36 ways that you could use other people's material. So how do you decide when it's acceptable and when it's not? There are a few approaches we could take. One approach is just to say, it's all allowable. I'm going to green light everything and be okay with all 36 options. That's one option. And that may be where somebody in here would stand. The other extreme would be to say, we're just going to put a big X, a big red light on all of it and say, we're just not going to allow anything to creep in. That's not very realistic, though, because we have all kinds of shaping influences and factors when it comes to what's forming our sermonic thinking. So if you've heard a sermon on this particular text before, even if it was in your childhood, it's still shaping your thinking. You still have that influence that you're bringing in with you when you preach. It's really impossible to preach as a blank slate. You're always bringing in influences. So another option would be to go like column by column and decide, okay, deceptive stealing, I'm just gonna, everything in this column, no. Cited borrowing, everything in this column, yeah. That would be one option. Another way you could make the decision is to go row by row. And maybe you decide some of the lower level items will just go across the board and say, I'm okay with all of that stuff. Some of the higher ones, I'm not so sure about that. Or here's my suggestion, go case by case. Each individual spot, figure out, where does this sit for me? I'm not going to walk you through all the instructions there. I don't actually want you to fill this out in the room today. I want it to be something that you can take back with you to your church, maybe even take back to your elders if you're in a context where you have some elders that can speak into this process, and just kind of prayerfully, theologically think through, where do I land on these 36 different items? And feel free to add other types of use of things that you can think of that maybe I left off of that particular document. Now, before we kind of wrestle with where we're going to land on some of these things, let me give you a roadmap for the rest of the workshop. So here's what I would like. Yeah, question? There should, got an extra one? Okay, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, you bet. No, you're good. Totally fine. So here's what I want to do for the rest of the workshop. I want to take just a few minutes and kind of give a pastoral response and acknowledge there are some understandable reasons why we lean into other preachers' material. Some very understandable reasons. After doing that, I want to give you a very, very quick kind of march through history to acknowledge that this isn't a new phenomenon. And then I want to proceed after that, and I want to give you some arguments, pro, and some rebuttals, con. And I want to wrap up by just giving you a few suggestions and some guiding questions. So that's kind of where I want to go in the next 25, 30 minutes. So let me go ahead and just acknowledge some of the understandable reasons why we lean into the material of others when we preach. Okay? Here's number one. I'm calling it the grind. According to Hunter Beckelheimer, a preacher who writes a new sermon every week, and I know that not all of you write sermons every week, but even if you're writing 30 or 40 sermons a week, it's still going to be close to this. He estimates that you're producing the amount of content that an author who writes a 400-page book every year is producing. That's a lot of content. If you're preaching 30 or 40 times, you're still talking 250 to 300 pages of content every single year. And with that kind of a grind, it's natural that we would lean in to some outside help. It's understandable. Second reason why I think it's understandable that we lean into the material of others, the comparison trap. Andy Stanley cautions us not to fall victim to the comparison trap and live in what he called the land of And as preachers, it can be so tempting to find ourselves living in the land of where we wish we were smarter, funnier, insightful, elegant, creative, and on the list could go. I know I made some of those words up. You get the idea. It's so easy to compare ourselves, particularly because our listeners have access to the greatest communicators in the English-speaking world at their fingertips. And the natural tendency is to compare ourselves and think, how can I become more like them? How can I compete with that? And once we realize we can't, then we decide, well, if you can't beat them, steal from them. And it's understandable that we would borrow their material. A third reason why I think it's understandable that we borrow is the responsibilities. Corey McPherson conducted a study among 400 Nazarene pastors in 2008 that revealed many of them resort to sermonic borrowing for the reason they have too many plates spinning. Their pastoral responsibilities. They can't keep spinning everything, and so the sermonic plate sometimes ends up getting kind of the short end of the straw. Fourth reason why it's understandable, accessibility. It's never been easier for you or for me to access other people's sermons. Whether you're watching on YouTube or you're podcasting, whether it's a free or subscription-based sermon resource platform, it's right there. It's never been more accessible. One author refers to all of these sermon sites as sermons are us. You walk into the virtual store, and you'll find every sermonic toy that your pastoral heart could ever desire. From sermon manuscripts and outlines to sermon graphics and bumper videos. They've got it all on sale too. It's there. It's all accessible. Just because it's accessible, however, doesn't mean we should always jump to it. Quick little story. You guys are probably familiar with the name Haddon Robinson, the great preaching professor. He tells a story of a time when his daughter was on a business trip, hopping on a plane, and she struck up a conversation with the guy in the seat next to her. Come to find out, this guy next to her writes sermons for a living to one of these sermon subscription sites. And as they got to talking, he confessed that he's not a believer. And she was kind of startled by this and said, well, how can you write sermons for Christians if you're not a Christian? And here was his response. Well, I don't have to study to put some good thoughts together. Is that what our preaching has been reduced to? Putting a few good thoughts together? Just because it's accessible doesn't mean we always want to go running to it. Number five, fifth, the reason why it's understandable that we might lean into other people's material is called the performance review. If you've been in preaching ministry long enough, you know that your weekly message is your highest profile activity. Nothing is more visible than what you do on a Sunday morning. And oftentimes, your effectiveness is evaluated based on those 30 minutes, or 35, or 25, or however long it is that you're given to preach. And because of that pressure to perform that we face every single week, sometimes it causes us to lean into different ways that we can improve our work, using other people's material. Number sixth reason why it's understandable that we would lean into other people's material is what I'm calling the first job. Just out of curiosity, there may not be anybody in this room who fits this bill, but are there any bivocational preachers in here? One? Okay. I think we probably need to have more conversations around what's expected from bivocational preachers. Like somebody who's working 40 plus hours a week outside of the church, and then 15-ish hours for the church. And in those 15 hours, they're expected to write a sermon, to do some shepherding, maybe some hospital visitation, maybe teach a class, maybe lead a small group, and on that list kind of goes. And us preaching professors expect these bivocational preachers to take 10 of those hours and work on a message. And because of the demands of other responsibilities, it's understandable that we might lean into utilizing other sources. Here's the seventh and final reason why I think it's understandable that we might lean into other material. The Saturday night special. Now, some preachers have to wait until Saturday to work on their message, like bivocational preachers. They might not have an opportunity until Saturday. That's not true of most of us. For most of us, if we're waiting until Saturday, not every week, but most weeks, if we wait this long, it's because we've been lazy, because we've had some misplaced priorities, or possibly because we've been procrastinating. And some of those overlap a little bit. So 7 reasons why I think it's understandable, though not all those are good reasons, but understandable why we might lean into using the material of others. Now, given the current state of the preaching world, we might assume this is kind of a recent phenomenon, utilizing other people's material. It's not. This has been a conversation point in the church for centuries. So what I want to do for a few minutes is just kind of trace you through a little history of this conversation. And I'm indebted to a couple chapters in Scott Gibson's little book, Should We Use Someone Else's Sermon, where he kind of traces this out for us. So let me go back all the way to Augustine. So late 4th, early 5th century, here was Augustine's take. He says, there are quite a few preachers out there who can deliver a sermon, they just can't write them. And so, for those who can't write them, what's the harm in them taking a well-written sermon, memorizing it, delivering it to their people? With one caveat, assuming they give credit. That was Augustine's take. Fast forward a couple years to Pope Gregory the Great. He reformed Catholic Mass to include reading sermons by church fathers and other great preachers. Actually encouraged priests. Preach other people's sermons, other homilies. Fast forward to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther encouraged young preachers to read his sermons from the pulpit. I know the sermons that you young pups are going to write, they're not going to be any good. I know mine are. Preach mine instead. That was kind of Luther's take. Around the same time, we move over to England. Apparently in England, plagiarism in preaching was so common that it caused King James to pass a law requiring preachers to preach at least one original sermon a month. If you're going to preach 4, at least make one of them yours. That was the standard in England around 1600. Fast forward to William Paley, late 18th century. Here was his take. Theologian William Paley says, as to preaching, if your situation requires a sermon every Sunday, make one, steal 5. So he lowered the bar. King James says, 1 out of 4. Paley says, 1 out of 6 is good enough. Not ultimately surprising that his theological writings, Paley's, end up getting accused of plagiarism, ironically enough. And then there's Charles Spurgeon. Now, not suggesting that Spurgeon himself was using other people's material, but everybody was using Spurgeon's material. Here, there was a little poem that was actually circulating among preaching circles around this time. Here was the little ditty. It said, there once was a preacher named Spurgey. No lover was he of liturgy. His sermons were fine, I use them as mine, and so do most of the clergy. Apparently it was pretty common in the days around and shortly after Charles Spurgeon. Even in more recent times, early 1900s, there's a story about the great preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick, early to mid-1900s. One time he was visiting a church. The young preacher preached a sermon, and within a minute, Fosdick realized, this is my sermon. After the message was over, he was the last person to greet the young preacher after everybody was kind of clearing out, and he reaches out his hand to the preacher and says, how long did it take you to prepare that message? A young man very confidently says, about 3 hours. And Fosdick says, young man, that sermon took me 21 hours to prepare. And it was in that moment that the young man realized who his guest was, the great Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick. And so here was the young man's response. Well, Dr. Fosdick, you keep writing him, I'll keep preaching him. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not a new conversation. This is a conversation that has been taking place in the church world from the beginning. How far is too far? When do we cross a line that using other people's material goes from ethical use to unethical use, to either moral or amoral to immoral? Let me give you some arguments now. What I'd like to do is give you 6 arguments that commonly get made in defense of using other people's material, whether it's using an entire message or something as simple as an illustration. 6 arguments in favor, and then I want to respond by giving 6 rebuttals. Now, these are not my arguments. These are not my rebuttals. If you just kind of dig around, you start doing some research, these are kind of the common arguments that you hear. I'm not suggesting I subscribe to all of these or any of them. And I'm not suggesting that I subscribe to any or all of the rebuttals either. But I am going to try to fairly lay them out as you might encounter them. Okay? So here are 6 arguments in favor of using the material of other people in our preaching. Argument number one is the history argument. The history argument says, well, Solomon told us there's nothing new under the sun. If you're preaching something that hasn't been spoken before, you're probably preaching heresy. Can you really expect in 2,000 years of Christian history that you're coming up with something original? That's the history argument, kind of in a nutshell. That's argument number one. Argument number two is what I'm calling the humility argument. I kind of alluded to it earlier. It's the argument that says, I came across this message, I was going to preach this text, and I realized, I don't think I could do it better myself. So I'm just going to allow this message to speak. I'm going to preach that message. That's the humility argument, to say, I don't think I could preach this sermon as good as they did. Argument number three is called the illustration argument. Here's how this argument develops. If, by and large, we accept and maybe even expect preachers to use other people's materials when it comes to their illustrations or maybe quotes or these little different parts of the sermon, why is it not acceptable to apply that same standard to the whole sermon? Why is it allowable for an illustration or story, but not allowable for the entire message? That's the illustration argument. The fourth argument is what I've called the body argument. Here's how the body argument operates. If we believe that the church is an organism, and if a preacher, we'll call the preacher an arm, if an arm in one geographic location preaches a message, then doesn't it belong to a leg preaching in a different geographic location? Ultimately, this argument says that the sermon isn't really proprietary content of the preacher, it belongs to the global church. That's kind of the body argument. A fifth argument that you might encounter as you're doing some research here is what I'm calling the music and Bible study argument. The music and Bible study argument says we don't really apply this standard to the songs that we sing on Sunday mornings. Like, we don't expect our worship team to be writing new songs for that occasion every Sunday. We don't really assume that for the curriculum that our small groups are studying. We're maybe assuming that we've got a small groups pastor who's developing that curriculum and then distributing it to the small group pastors and those small group leaders. And those leaders aren't necessarily like writing their own material. They're using prepackaged stuff. So why do we hold the sermon to a standard that we hold nothing else in our church to? It seems like it's given a different standard than everything else. That's kind of the music Bible study argument. Then the last one is what I'm calling the kingdom argument. It's pretty similar to the body argument. The kingdom argument says if we're preaching for the purposes of edifying believers, reaching the lost, and advancing God's kingdom, then who cares who wrote the sermon? Does it really matter? I mean, as long as we ultimately do what we've been called to do, does it really matter whose sermon is being preached, who wrote it, who's delivering it? So those are the 6 most common arguments I've encountered as I've been kind of studying through this. This is not an exhaustive list. You could probably find some more. You could probably come up with a couple others, but these are 6 of the most common arguments that you would see in favor of using other people's material, whether it's using an entire sermon or just different parts of a message. Now, let me offer rebuttals to each of these. And again, these are not necessarily my rebuttals, but these are common rebuttals that you would encounter. So the first argument was the history argument, the one that says there's nothing new under the sun, you're not preaching anything new anyway. The rebuttal to this is the situational argument. The situational argument says you're taking Solomon out of context. When Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, he wasn't talking about the weekly sermonic event. Solomon would have recognized that every time we preach, we are in fact doing something that is new under the sun. Every Sunday is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You will never have the same group of people in the same place, in the same exact life circumstances, because all preaching is situational preaching. All preaching is contextual. And so the task of the preacher in that moment is to preach a word from God for that situation. So that's the rebuttal to the history argument. The rebuttal to the humility argument, remember the humility argument said, I couldn't do it better if I tried myself. The rebuttal isn't really as much of a rebuttal as much as it is more of a disclaimer. Disclaimer that says, hey, if you're going to do that, if you're going to use somebody else's sermon, then at least give them credit. Like, at least acknowledge what you're doing. That's the disclaimer. In response to the illustration argument, the rebuttal is what I'm going to call anecdotal use. The anecdotal use response says, let's use writing as a metaphor, as an analogy. Now, we recognize writing a paper and preaching a sermon are not parallel. There are some points of overlap, but there are also points of divergence. But here's one point of overlap. Whenever we write papers at academic level, so if you think back to like Bible college days, for those of you that went to Bible college, or maybe you went on to seminary and wrote some papers, the expectation was that you're doing your own research, you're pulling from different sources, a quote here, a thought here, an idea here, and you're pulling all of that together into your paper. And even though you're pulling from different sources, the totality of the paper is your work. The same is true with the sermon. Even though we're pulling from different places, the totality of the work should be our message. That's the anecdotal use rebuttal. In response to the body argument, the one that said, hey, the sermon really belongs to the global church, the rebuttal is the local church rebuttal. The local church rebuttal says, hey, Paul wrote letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians around the same time. If we assume that both of those are prison epistles, let's say hypothetically Ephesians is written first. He writes Ephesians, which seems to be somewhat of a circular letter. Colossians is kind of in that circle. Then within a year or two, maybe, he writes Colossians. And if you put Ephesians and Colossians side by side, there's a lot of overlapping content. So why doesn't Paul just tell the Colossians, read that other letter? Because he recognized that they needed a situational word. It wasn't just for that particular, Ephesians can go to anybody and everybody. Now, there are counter rebuttals to this and counter rebuttals that I could get into, but I'll save you that. We'll move on. Number 5. In response to the music or Bible study argument, the rebuttal is an honesty rebuttal. Here's how this rebuttal goes. The expectation of most of our people is that when they come to church on a Sunday morning, they know exactly what they're doing when they're singing songs. They recognize that we are gathering our voices with the global choir. That's kind of the expectation. They're not expecting new content every time. However, when it comes to preaching, they probably are expecting original content, that the preacher took the time, prayerfully studied the word, listened to the Spirit's guiding in the process, wrote and crafted a message, internalized it, and then preaches it to that particular context. And so to use somebody else's material, play it off like it's our own, dishonest and deceptive. That's the rebuttal for the music and Bible study argument. And the last one was the kingdom argument. The rebuttal here is the end doesn't justify the means. The rebuttal says, hey, look, the argument that you're making about this whole, as long as the kingdom is advancing, who cares how we get there? Really what you're saying is the ends justifies the means. But we know full well that God doesn't just care where we go. He cares equally about how we get where we're going, about what we do and how we do it. That's the rebuttal. So you've heard 6 arguments in favor of utilizing other people's material, and you've heard 6 rebuttals. Some of them might be more convincing to you than others. Some of them might be less convincing to you than others, and that's totally okay. So now that we've got all of this, how do we know where the line is? How do we know when we've gone too far? Again, I told you I'm not going to answer that question for you, but I do want to conclude with a few suggestions and then a few guiding questions. So here's suggestion number 1. These I don't think are going to be on the screen. Suggestion number 1, I think on occasion it might be okay and might even be best for you to preach somebody else's sermon. There might be times where you've had a busy week, you had a family crisis, you listened to a message on a text that you were going to preach and you realize that's perfect, that's exactly what my listeners need. And on rare occasions, it might be beneficial or necessary for you to preach somebody else's sermon, even in its entirety. If you do that on occasion, make sure it is on occasion. Don't make a regular habit of doing that. And if you are going to do that, please, please, please acknowledge what you're doing to your people. Give credit where credit is due. Let them know this isn't your original message. And then if you're going to do it, see if you can adapt it a little bit. See if you can edit it and make it more your own. You might change some of the language. You might recraft the introduction to make it more fitting to your series. You might craft the illustrations, take out some of their personal illustrations, bring in your personal illustrations, edit and adapt it to make it your own voice, your own style, your own personality. Okay? So suggestion number 1 is there might be occasions when you might utilize even an entire message from somebody else. And for what it's worth, I guess I'm granting you a little bit of permission there. Suggestion number 2, if you are going to use somebody else's personal illustration, don't pretend like it's yours. That's just deceptive and dishonest. There's no other way around that. Don't pretend like something that happened to somebody else happened to you. You're just lying to your people. Third suggestion, I would encourage you to preach by the golden rule. Imagine yourself as a listener. How would you want to be treated by your preacher and their preparation process if you were in the audience? And that third suggestion kind of weaves into the first of the 4 questions that I want to leave you with. So I want to give you 4 guiding questions that you can take home with you as you begin to chew on this and process, where is this line for me? Here's question number 1. What does my audience expect from me as their preacher? Scott McKnight, who teaches at Northern Seminary, reminds us that those who are listening to us preach probably expect the words coming out of our mouth to be our words, unless we give them reason to think otherwise. Now, that doesn't mean that your listeners are expecting endless footnoting. They don't want that. They don't need that. That would be painful to listen to. Footnote every sentence. That's not a good idea. But they probably are expecting some originality from your preaching. Second guiding question. What are your motives when it comes to utilizing other people's materials? Whether it's something as simple as an illustration, maybe a main heading, maybe a dominant thought, or even an entire message. What motivates you to utilize other people's material? Is it something like, I want to save some time? There's nothing wrong with trying to be a good steward of your work hours and the time that God has given you for your ministry. Is your motivation to bless your congregation with the best possible message they could hear? Or to spark your own creativity? There are times where I'll read or listen to somebody else's sermon on a text I'm going to preach, and I may not use what they're doing, but it might spin off some creativity for me. What's your motivation? Or are your motives a little bit more impure? And let's just be honest, sometimes as preachers, our motivation for using other people's material is a little bit mixed. We're kind of looking for a little bit of a pat on the back, a little bit of recognition, a little bit of acknowledgement of, oh, that was a great message. So what are your motives for using other people's material? Let that be kind of a guiding question. Guiding question number 3. This is one that doesn't show up a whole lot in the conversation. I think it needs to. How could my use of somebody else's material impact the person I'm borrowing from? How could it impact their credibility, their reputation? I've heard several stories of this. Let me just share one that's personal to me. I'm a podcaster. I've always been kind of a sermon junkie ever since I came here as a student at Ozark. And so I started, by the time I was in my senior year here, I was probably podcasting 6 or 7 different churches every week, listening to those faithfully. And a couple years later, as I'm listening, I hear one preacher preach a sermon, and in the sermon they tell a story, very personal story, very unique story. And then 3 weeks later, I hear another preacher that I'm listening to tell the exact same unique, very unique story as if it happened to him. And so guess whose credibility came into question? Both of them. One of them was being entirely sincere and honest. One of them was not. And to this day, I don't know who it was. But both of their credibility came into question because one of them, in an unhealthy way, use somebody else's material. So when we are going to use somebody else's material, we need to be asking the question, how does my use of their material potentially impact their own credibility? That's a question we got to wrestle with. Final guiding question I want to land on. Have you given God and your church your very best this week? And I recognize your best this week is different from your best last week. And your best last week is different from your best next week. Every week comes with its own unique set of challenges. There are going to be weeks that you've got some family stuff going on that's going to keep you from investing what you would hope to invest. There are going to be some weeks where you've got just some church issues that are surfacing and you don't have as much time to give to the message as you would like. I get that. So your best one week might be different from some other week. For instance, this week, some of you are going to be preaching on Sunday. And you've been here for 3 days, and you're getting a late start on your message. So you're going to be listening to Jeff Walling tonight, hoping that he crushes it so that you've got a sermon ready for Sunday morning. Like, I've been there. I know the game. If that's the best that you can do, you can breathe easy. Give God your very best. Danny Smith did his Doctor of Ministry from Acadia Divinity School up in Canada. And he did his dissertation on sermon borrowing. And Smith reminds us that before preaching is anything else, preaching is first and foremost an act of spiritual formation in the life of the preacher. So, are you, preacher, giving God every opportunity every week to form you, shape you, and mold you more and more into the likeness of his son Jesus? Don't rob yourself or the Holy Spirit of the greatest transformative opportunity in your week. Let me pray for you, and then we're out of time, but I'd be happy to field some questions. I know there's some things I couldn't cover, so if you want to catch me afterward, I'm going to stick around for Mark's talk as well. I'd be happy to discuss this further with you. Let me pray for you, and then I'll wrap up. God, I thank you for these men who have hearts that long to be faithful, hearts who want to faithfully proclaim and declare your truth, who want to have honest ministry, who want to be trustworthy and true, want to be faithful with the calling that's been entrusted to them, want to allow your Spirit to do his best work in our lives. And so I pray that if nothing else, that we've just started a conversation, given some of these guys some things to chew on, some things to wrestle with, to help them recognize for themselves what that line looks like. Thank you for all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'd encourage you to take that handout with you, and when you got some time later this week, just kind of prayerfully reflect on it, wrestle through it, and maybe kind of fill it out. You can follow the instructions there. Thank you, guys.
By grace I am restored, and now I freely walk into the arms of Christ my Lord. Let praise rise up and